All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Today and this week, it is so good to be here together. My name is Sam Finn, and I'm the Director of Newcomer Policy and Practice at Californians Together, where we are proud to partner with the California Department of Social Services in supporting the CalNEW program. Today, our guests will be discussing the current system and rights for unaccompanied and undocumented youth in our schools, as well as partnership models for serving them well in our schools. It's important for us to acknowledge here that in supporting our immigrant students and communities, we are facing extraordinary uncertainty and challenges in the coming months and years. I am so grateful that our speakers can help inform us and empower us in understanding our systems of law and support. Thank you. The more we know, the more we can do. And in understanding our context and possible futures, I'd like us to kick off with a breaking update from the governor's office. We can look on the next page. Today, Governor Newsom released a relevant proclamation for widespread dissemination. The proclamation notes that the previous Trump administration took many actions in conflict with California's values and that California accordingly filed more than 120 lawsuits challenging Trump's actions as an administration. Therefore, the governor is convening the legislature on December 2nd to consider and act upon legislation necessary to challenge potential Trump administration actions. You can read the full proclamation on our resource page, which I am just going to drop into the chat right now. And let's go ahead to the next slide. So, a quick overview of our time together today. We're going to start with some background on the CalNEW program and this year's webinar series. We'll continue with the National Center for Youth Law, and then hand the floor over to our colleagues at Immigrant Legal Defense and West Contra Costa Unified School District. We'll conclude the day with general discussion and questions, and we'll have a little time for questions after each presentation. And let's move to the next slide and give some background on the program supporting today's webinar. The CalNEW program was first developed in 2016 by the state legislature to provide supports to socioeconomically disadvantaged newcomer youth and their families through the school system. This initiative, which is administered by the California Department of Social Services, provides grants to 21 school districts across California and looks for ways to spread knowledge and best practices in both newcomer education and newcomer well-being. Let's take a look at some of our future webinars coming up that can provide more knowledge and best practice areas. Later this year, we will have 3 more events with expert speakers sharing ways to support newcomers in education and well-being. And you can sign up with a link on the resource page for any of these. Our next webinar will focus on safe and welcoming school environments for newcomer youth with Californians Together, the California Newcomer Network, and Reimagining Migration Sharing. We'll go to the next slide. If you have any questions for our presenters, please feel free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom, which you'll find in the bottom toolbar. A recording from today's session, along with all slides and resources, will be posted on the California Newcomer Network next week and emailed out tomorrow to everyone who is registered for today's webinar. And so without further ado, I am excited to turn things over to our speakers, starting with the National Center for Youth Law.
Thanks so much, Sam. Hi, everybody. My name is Melissa Adamson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an attorney at the National Center for Youth Law. For those of us who don't know who we are or haven't had the privilege to meet yet, the National Center for Youth Law has been around for more than 50 years, and we're a nonprofit law firm based in Oakland. We have different teams that work on different issues and systems impacting kids. So we have a health team, a juvenile justice team, and we have an immigration team, which is where I sit, and I'll be talking about this information today from that perspective. Each of our teams uses different tools to advance the goals of each team, like litigation, research, policy advocacy. And so today I'll talk to you about our immigration work. Here are the main tools that our immigration team uses to advance our goal, which is to ensure that immigrant children, broadly defined, are able to live in communities rather than in government custody, and that they have the resources that they need to heal and to thrive. So our expertise and our role in this work goes back to the 1980s, when we and co-counsel filed a case called Flores, which set the national standards for how immigrant children have to be treated when they're in federal immigration custody. And as lawyers on that case, we monitor federal detention facilities, we interview detained kids regularly, and we have deep knowledge of the system and how it impacts kids. And I'll be speaking about that with you today. And while most of our team's work has been really focused on kids in federal immigration custody, we also work to support immigrant children's rights in the community and in schools and after they've been released from custody. So I may have met you in some of that relevant work. Um, so I'll start with this chart, which is a broad picture, because when we talk about children in immigrant families, there are a lot of different things that can mean. There are a lot of different categories, some of them overlap, and if you're not deeply steeped in this area, it's kind of confusing. In California, newcomer youth, as you all I'm sure know, are defined as children between 3 and 21 who are not born in the United States and have not been attending school in the United States for more than 3 academic years. But that can mean a lot of things. It includes a lot of children in the buckets that you see on your screen. That could include children that arrive as refugees with their families. That could include children seeking asylum or other forms of immigration relief. And it could include unaccompanied children who might be eligible for different kinds of immigration relief. And because we don't have consistent data, we don't know exactly how many newcomer students in California school districts fall into each of these different groups. But the differences are important because it affects their eligibility for certain resources and for certain programs. Today, we're going to focus on unaccompanied youth. And so those children will fall into the bucket that I've starred on the right. They're undocumented. And so I'll speak to their experience in the federal immigration system. And Katie and Yvonne are going to speak to their experience once they are released as sponsors in our communities. And Katie will also highlight some distinctions between unaccompanied children and refugee youth. But before I start, I wanted to take a moment, which I've been thinking a lot about, to talk about how a second Trump term might impact children and immigrant families really across all of the categories that you see on your screen right now. Um, Having been a lawyer representing immigrant children during the first Trump term, and having listened very, very closely to what Trump has said he will do in his second term, it's very clear that attacks on immigrant children and families are going to be at the forefront of his agenda. He has not been quiet about that. He's actually been very specific about some of the things that he wants to do. And so if you've been tuning those things out, or if you need a refresher on possibly what we can expect over the next couple of years, I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that he said he's going to do. The first is end birthright citizenship for children born to undocumented parents. So essentially, change the law that you would need one parent to be a citizen or legal permanent resident to get automatic citizenship at birth. That would be an enormous change. He said he wants to implement the largest mass deportation effort in United States history and use massive detention camps. That would have a big impact on mixed citizenship families. If you have students that live in families where maybe one adult is documented, one parent is not. He wants to end DACA, which is a federal program that protects undocumented immigrants who came to the US as kids from deportation and provides them with work authorization. He wants to militarize the border and essentially close it to anyone seeking safety. He wants to suspend refugee resettlement altogether. And he wants to severely restrict currently existing legal immigration pathways like asylum and diversity, lottery visas, and temporary programs like parole. That's a lot of different pieces of our immigration system as we know it today. And so with kind of all of that said, I'm really grateful to be here with you today, people who are interested and care about supporting newcomer immigrant kids in a time where they're going to need your support more than they probably ever have before. And so I'm very grateful to be here with you today. I can see chats coming in briefly. I'm going to try to read it as I go. For the question about T and U, that stands for trafficking, and U is just the where the visa came in the order of the alphabet. I believe Katie can correct me on that if I'm wrong. Trafficking visas have certain eligibility requirements around that person's exposure to trafficking. U visas is a category of visa for people who kind of assisted a law enforcement entity in crime. Thank you, Katie. She's going to give you a better definition than I just did there. But I'm going to start by defining unaccompanied children, just so we're all on the same page. Oops, there we go. I missed a couple slides. There we go. So the definition of unaccompanied children comes from federal law. It comes from the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which is a mouthful. It's colloquially referred to by its acronym, which is the TVPRA. And that's a law that's been in effect since 2008. And it was passed with bipartisan support, actually. At that time, it was a common value held between parties that children arriving alone were particularly vulnerable and deserving of extra support and protection in the United States. So, an unaccompanied child is defined as a child who arrives to our country who does not have legal immigration status, who is not yet 18 years old, and does not have a parent or a legal guardian that is available and with them to provide care and physical custody. You may have also seen the term undocumented unaccompanied minor, or UUM, used in the California state context. It means the same thing, but this is the federal definition of that term. And one piece that I want to note here is that while many children arrive at the border truly alone and without any family members with them, many arrive with non-parent family members, like an aunt or grandma or grandpa, or maybe an older sibling or a cousin. But due to this federal definition, children arriving with non-parent family members are determined to be unaccompanied, and they are separated from those non-parent family members when they're in immigration custody. And that's something that has always been the case. That was not new under Trump. That happened under Obama and under Biden. That is the way the federal definition operates. So I'm going to start with a broad overview and then go more into depth onto each of these stages. So in general, once unaccompanied children make it to the United States-Mexico border, and when I say border, I'm really talking about the southern border because very, very few children cross over our northern border with Canada. Once they make it to the US-Mexico border, they're taken into custody by Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. Then they're transferred to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, and they're detained in ORR custody until they can be released to a sponsor in the community, and then they wait for their immigration court date. Now, the vast majority of unaccompanied children arriving have family members in the United States to whom they can be released. So this is the general trajectory of most unaccompanied kids. And I will note that this slide assumes that children are being permitted to approach the border, which is what our law requires. It doesn't list all of the border policies that exist now or could exist in the future that could restrict their ability to approach the border and seek help. So when we talk about unaccompanied children, we're talking about kids, as you know, because you see them in your schools, that come from all over the world. And what's really interesting is we kind of talk about ORR custody or federal immigration custody as a mirror of world events that might happen just a couple months later. So relative percentages of certain countries shift and change in response to certain sociopolitical factors. So this is a map. And as of this month, there were children in federal immigration custody from all of these different countries. And you'll see that the United States is colored in because there are youth that arrive pregnant to the United States and then give birth to children when they're in federal immigration custody. And so those children are United States citizens. Right now, the majority of children are from Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico. For many reasons, mostly proximity, relative instability, due to economics and US imperialism. That's the majority of kids that we see coming over the border, but this shifts over time. So just last month, there were children from over 50 countries. And in 2021, we saw more unaccompanied Afghan youth than we ever have before, and children from Ukraine, which we had never seen before, coming into our system. And as you all know, these children are not a monolithic population. They have really different needs. You know, you could have a child from Guatemala that speaks an indigenous language like Quiche and grew up farming in a really rural area. And you could have a kid from urban Kabul who speaks Dari and English and was about to enter college when they were evacuated. And so when we talk about kids coming to our border, these are kids with really diverse life experiences and really different needs. So while every kid's story is unique, I will share what I found to be the general trends from the children that I've personally interviewed and represented over the past several years. And you'll see quote bubbles in the next couple of slides, and these come from interviews that I've conducted with children in custody. So in general, many of the children that I've spoken with have shared experiencing deep poverty and a severe lack of access to basic services before they left their home country. things like lack of food and water and shelter and medical care. Many of the children that I've interviewed have shared that they've experienced direct violence, threats to their safety. Many, mostly girls, have shared stories of sexual assault and abuse or threats of things like that happening to them. Many boys have referenced gang violence, other exploitative economies like being forced to sell or traffic drugs that they wanted to avoid, and so they decide to flee. And many make the decision to flee for their own safety or for the safety of their family members. So, for example, I interviewed this little boy who's quoted here. He was 13 years old and he fled with his 6-year-old sister and his 10-year-old aunt because his stepfather threatened to kill him and his sister. And he knew it wasn't safe to stay there any longer and he had to leave. And so he fled and he made the migration journey to the United States alone with 2 smaller children in tow. So as you can imagine, children's journeys to the United States are often extremely, extremely difficult. There's increased exposure to violence and abuse. Again, even more lack of access to food, water, and shelter. And depending on where the child is coming from, the journey might look very, very different. Some children walk here. Some children hold onto the tops of huge freight trains or ride buses for days. Others traverse the Darien Gap, which is a very dangerous and mountainous area between Central and South America. Some fly between multiple countries before making their way up through Central America. And again, these children may be traveling with parents or guardians or non-parents like aunts or uncles, but many of the children that I speak with have come truly alone and are making this journey by themselves. So you can imagine the children and youth that you work with making this journey by themselves and how difficult that is in so many different ways. So once children reach the border, they're apprehended by Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. And they might be apprehended at a port of entry. That's kind of like the official crossing place at a border. If you've ever driven into Mexico, you would be driving through a port of entry. Or they might cross between ports of entry over the border and get picked up by Border Patrol. Either way, at that point, they're entering CBP, Customs and Border Protection, custody. Now, these facilities, CBP facilities, were built to house single men. They are fundamentally inappropriate settings for children or really any human being. They're notorious for really cruel, inhumane conditions of confinement. And if you've seen images in the media associated with kids in cages, these are those facilities that you've seen pictures of. Kids often call them hieleras or freezers because they are pretty cold or they feel very cold in the facilities. In certain facilities, the lights are kept on for many hours of the day. People often sleep on mats under pretty thin silver mylar blankets. Some people report that the food is cold or still frozen. Children typically report that there's a big lack of privacy. And while there's been a lot of litigation and efforts in recent years, especially to improve the conditions in these facilities, our team, which does site visits pretty frequently, continues to find, continued evidence of really unsanitary conditions and really concerning conditions. Um, Now, the good piece of this, if there is a good piece, is that children are only supposed to be in CBP custody for a maximum of 72 hours. These are really supposed to be processing stations and used for a limited period of time. Unfortunately, what we've seen happen is that if the number of children arriving goes up, we've seen CBP get backlogged with kids, and they end up spending more and more time in CBP custody. Children, when they enter CBP custody, are supposed to be screened within 48 hours to determine if they're unaccompanied or not. So that looks like a CBP official interviewing a child. If they came with an aunt or an uncle, they're interviewing that adult, they're trying to figure out who they are. And if that person that a child came with is not their parent and not their legal guardian, they are transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is called ORR. And that's mostly what I'll be talking about today. So ORR, children are kept in ORR custody until ORR finds a sponsor to whom they can be released. That can happen quickly. It can also take a very long time. And while they're in OR custody, children are required generally to be placed in facilities that hold state licenses to care for dependent children. So, for example, there are ORR facilities in California, and they hold the same type of licensure as a group home for foster kids, and they have to follow all of the same state law requirements like food, medical care, staffing ratios, even the width of the hallways for fire safety codes. All of those licensure requirements also should apply to these facilities. And children are supposed to be placed in the least restrictive environment. Um, but as you can see from the quote that I've included here from a girl that I interviewed, often ORR custody does not feel least restrictive. It actually feels very restrictive. So let's talk about what ORR custody actually looks like and feels like for the kids that are held there. So this is a map of the ORR facilities across the country. As of this month, ORR contracts with 289 different facilities located in 29 states across the country to house unaccompanied children while they wait to be released to their sponsors. And kids are placed, as you can see, all over the United States. So even though a child may eventually be released to a sponsor in California and end up in your school or, in your services, they might have been detained in a facility in New York or Virginia or Texas. They might have been transferred through multiple facilities. So their experience might be very different. As of November 1st, there were a little over 6,000 kids in ORR custody, and the majority were in shelters, which are these yellow dots. Shelters are congregate care facilities, and they range from 8 kids to 1,000 kids. And so your experience at an ORR shelter will really just depend on where you're placed. I visited multiple shelters throughout the country and interviewed children detained there. And even though they're not technically secure placements, they do feel very restrictive. Even small shelters that should feel better. They're often small buildings, they're often surrounded by metal chain link fences. The windows and doors are usually alarmed. Outdoor space is very limited. And children's entire world is the facility. They eat there, they sleep there, they go to school there. So they essentially never leave, with the exception of some short outings once a week that might last for a few hours, depending on the shelter's policies. Kind of general themes from kids that I interview. They're often overwhelmed by the number of rules they have to follow, a complete lack of privacy. They are absolutely never alone, very limited autonomy, and just a pervasive sense of unknown. They don't know when they're going to be released. They don't know how long they're going to be there, and they just want to get out and be reunited with their family. One note here, in the past, when numbers of children in custody have been higher, ORR has used influx or unlicensed facilities to place kids because they didn't have enough shelter space. They've used convention centers, military bases, old worker housing at oil fields to house kids. We visited all of those sites. And so some children you interact with, depending on when they were in government custody, may have experienced really massive detention facilities for longer periods of time. But those are not currently in use right now. Just to flag a couple of other placements that children you work with may have experienced. There are two different types of foster care for ORR. These are much smaller numbers of beds, so it's more unlikely that children you work with may have experienced them. But transitional foster care and long-term foster care placements are prioritized for certain categories of kids. So children that are under 13, children with special needs or disabilities, maybe a youth that is pregnant, are prioritized for these kinds of placements, where they're placed with a more typical foster family situation, where it's a house, they get to go to school in the community, and it feels more like a family placement. And then finally, more restrictive placements are the ones listed in purple. And these are more restrictive, which means they have higher staff ratios. There's no freedom of movement. They have locked doors. These are more akin to juvenile halls or detention facilities for kids adjudicated in the United States. And children might be transferred or what we call stepped up to these facilities if facilities feel like a child needs more supervision or mental health services that a shelter can't provide. What we've seen over the years is that children with disabilities are more likely to end up in more restrictive settings. We actually ended up litigating that, and ORR is, due to our lawsuit, going to have to do different policies moving forward to hopefully prevent that, but it's what we have seen over the years. So how do kids get out of ORR custody? Kids remain detained until they can be released to a sponsor. And again, the majority of children do have a sponsor, usually a family member here in the United States to whom they can be released. And this chart shows the order of priority that ORR uses to find sponsors for kids. Their number one priority is to try to find a parent if a child does have a parent in the United States. And then you can see it goes all the way down the list from legal guardian, adult relative, somebody else that a parent can designate, all the way down to an unrelated adult is really their least they don't want to end up with an unrelated adult, and they would like to avoid that. So ORR's entire job is to vet the sponsor that is applying for an unaccompanied child. Um, and kind of the intensity to which ORR investigates and vets that sponsor increases as you go down this list. So as the relationship of the sponsor to the child becomes farther apart, like an unrelated adult, or maybe a family friend that's kind of like a cousin, that's kind of like Uncle Joe, but he's not actually an uncle, ORR will investigate that person more closely. There's more scrutiny on that relationship and more scrutiny on that identity. And so just to review the sponsor process, when a child enters ORR custody, and this is something we get a lot of questions on from school districts who are confused about who the sponsor is kind of appearing with this child trying to enroll in their school. So when a child enters ORR custody, they are assigned a case manager. And that case manager's entire job is to try and find a sponsor for the child to be released to. Now, they start by trying to identify potential sponsors. So the first step is they talk to the child, because the child often knows who the family member is that they can be released to. This is maybe a conversation that has typically happened before the child came to the United States. They already know, like, I'm going to be reunited with my Aunt Maria. She's in Texas. Here's her phone number. She's awaiting your call. She knows you're going to call her. Children often come across the border with phone numbers written on their arms in Sharpie or documents in Ziploc bags that are tied with duct tape to keep them from getting wet. And so this process of identification is the case manager talking to the child. If the child has an aunt or a parent back in home country or in the United States, they're talking to that person to try to figure out who the potential sponsor could be. Now, once they've identified that potential sponsor, they explain the process of sponsor application to that person. And the sponsor fills out the application packet. That packet is pretty extensive. It requires a lot of information about, the sponsor's identity, their relationship to the child, their address, their employment, what their housing is. Um, and through this process, the case manager is supposed to help the sponsor fill out the packet, provide that documentation. And there's a number of interviews throughout this process, multiple conversations between the case manager and the sponsor to really verify the information provided. And then depending on the relationship to the child, they might do background checks and fingerprinting, where they require that sponsor to go in and get their fingerprints taken, to have those fingerprints run through the federal system and do a background check. Certain cases require home studies. Um, the TVPRA, that federal law that I talked about, has certain categories of children that are seen to be more vulnerable or, at risk of abuse. And so the TVPRA mandates, for example, home studies for a child who has experienced trafficking, for a child who might have been identified as having a disability, for children of a certain age. And so for those cases, a home study case manager goes in person to the potential sponsor's home, evaluates the residents, interviews the potential sponsor and any other adults living in that home. And then after that, there's multiple layers of review for that case. So once all of that information is put together, the case manager makes a recommendation on whether the child should be released to that sponsor. And then that recommendation is reviewed by another person, a third-party contractor. And then once that person reviews it, it goes to a third layer of review, which is a federal field specialist at ORR, who makes the final decision, taking into account all of the information that is surfaced. And then once that case is approved, the child is released to that sponsor. And that's when they are released from ORR custody and go into the community. So I'll pause here before I pass to Katie. And we can change the slide sharing to see if there are any questions. I'm looking at the chat, but Sam, also, if you've seen any questions come in, please feel free to call.
Let me uplift a couple I saw earlier. First, there is the question is, might the removal of the right to citizenship for children being born from undocumented parents be retroactive, or would it only be moving forward?
I don't think he's stated that for certain. He may not know what they plan to do in this executive order that he said he'll release on day one of his presidency. I would imagine, though, that it would be moving forward. It would be logistically incredibly difficult to go backwards and figure all of that out. So I would imagine it's going forward.
Good to hear. Another question, how might we guide 12th grade high school students who have legalized status to complete the FAFSA, but might be fearful of their parents being deported because of lack of documentation?
That's a great question. I might see if we save that one for Katie and Yvonne.
Sure.
Thoughts on kind of information sharing.
And then maybe one more question before we move along. Susie just asked, do sponsors need to have legal status in this country?
That is a great question, and they do not. And that has been a huge issue. That was a huge issue under the first Trump administration, because they did a memorandum of understanding between ORR and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and basically shared the information of potential sponsors with ORR had to share the information of potential sponsors with ICE, and then ICE picked up potential sponsors and deported them, essentially not only deporting that adult, but then depriving the child in custody of a potential sponsor that they could go home to. And what we saw with that was a huge backlog of kids in custody because sponsors were afraid to come forward. Because they were scared that if they came forward to apply for a child in custody, that they would be deported. And when you're thinking of a lot of these families as some people might be undocumented, some might have come to the country and had another child, so they might have a citizen child. We talked to a lot of sponsors who were faced with this impossible choice of I have a citizen child here. I'm undocumented. I want to come forward as a sponsor to get my child out of custody. But if I do, I risk being deported, leaving my other child alone. So it was just impossible decisions for a lot of sponsors to make. But sponsors don't have to be documented. I would expect the Trump administration to really target that population.
That's really helpful clarification. Following up on that question about guardians, are sponsors considered legal guardians?
They are not. So to become a legal guardian of a child, that requires a court process to be determined to have your official kind of parental rights or guardianship rights assigned to an adult. So sponsors don't become legal guardians. However, and we'll talk about this more later, there is a form in California called the Caregiver Authorization Affidavit that ensures that sponsors, even if they're not a legal guardian or parent of a child, can enroll them in school, can consent for certain medical care depending on their relationship to the child. And so even though sponsors aren't given legal guardianship rights, at least in the state of California, thanks to this form that we have and state law, they have a lot of the same abilities as guardians.
Going to ask one more question and take note of these other questions for the end, but an important question on nomenclature from Alejandro. In terms of unaccompanied minors entering a school district, do they continue to be unaccompanied minors even as they have a sponsor?
Yes, they do.
Thank you. It is all very complicated and it is so helpful to hear it laid out.
And
Appreciate
I
it.
can jump in quickly to answer Oliver's question. Who would schools communicate with if sponsors are not legal guardians? They would still communicate with the sponsor of the child. And Michelle raises a great point that depending on the housing status of an accompanied youth, if they're living doubled up or if they're couch surfing or living with multiple families, they could fall under the umbrella of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Act, which is a great point.
To quickly follow up on that too, they remain unaccompanied children for under immigration definition, and there are some protections for them that we'll talk about in a few slides for their immigration case.
Fantastic. All right. We have a lot of questions, and Carolina, don't worry, I'm writing them all down for later. Let me now turn it over to our great team of Immigrant Legal Defense and West Contra Costa Unified School District, and we'll do some more questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you all for joining. It's really great to see such a high turnout. My name is Katie Annand. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a managing attorney with Immigrant Legal Defense, a nonprofit based in Oakland, California. Again, I'm really happy to be in community with you all today. I will admit that my jaw and neck have been very tight the past couple of days, just as we're all experiencing a lot of stress and emotions. So if I start talking too fast, please let me know, because also when I get passionate about things, I might start talking really quickly. So I'll be mindful of that, but please feel free to send me a chat or put a chat in the chat box as well. So just a little bit about immigrant legal defense, and then I'm going to pick up where Melissa left off in terms of the flow through the immigration system for unaccompanied children in particular, but also we'll mention some differences for families. And then we'll talk about ILD's partnerships with school districts, but in particular with Richmond High School and the Internationals Academy, and Yvonne will join me there. So Immigrant Legal Defense, or ILD, is a nonprofit, again, based in Oakland, California. We serve clients across the state of California, including families, children, and also detained individuals in facilities across the country, actually. We also engage in litigation and statewide trainings and mentorship to other legal providers and community outreach. Relevant for today's call, we most commonly receive our case referrals, so the individuals who will become our clients, through our education partnerships. We, for one, partner with 9 Cal State University, CSU campuses, and provide free legal services to students, their family, and faculty and staff. And we also provide similar services to 34 community colleges across the state. I work with our K through 12 partnerships, in which we are trying to build more practices around partnering between a legal services organization and a school district or a school site. And so the cases that I work on, the young people that I represent, the majority of them or their families are attending a school that we partner with. Okay, so just to, we're midway through or so this presentation, just a few questions just to start thinking about and reflecting on yourself. Feel free to write these down or take a photo or a screenshot. So we're already starting to talk about the different immigration processes, and particularly for unaccompanied children who might be in your school site or someone you're providing services to. So just thinking through what you already know, what from today is a surprise, what is something that you're really familiar with, and then also, what do you want to know in service of supporting the educational journey and needs of a young person who is impacted by the immigration system? We will hopefully have some time at the end to return to these questions, but just also, I hope, helpful to think about your own school district, etc., as we're moving through today's presentation. Okay, so picking up again where Melissa left off, as when a young person is released, an unaccompanied child is released from the ORR facility in which they had been detained, they're released to a sponsor. And these are numbers from fiscal year 2023. I'll update a couple counties with the 2024 numbers. ORR publishes online. The link is in the bottom corner here, but also in the materials that Sam, and yeah, just added right here. So you can access the link directly. ORR will update the number of unaccompanied children who are released per county across the country, not just California, if there are 50 or more children released to that county during that fiscal year being October 1st through September 30th. So we are in fiscal year 2025 right now. So you can see these numbers. LA County historically is the highest receiving county in California for unaccompanied children, numbers from fiscal year 2023. I picked a few counties across the state just to give a comparison of the numbers are still high of unaccompanied children for some of the reasons that Melissa talked about are coming to the US. So LA County for fiscal year 2024, only through the end of August, so still missing 1 month of this data, was already at 3,180, so really similar numbers. Alameda County at 643, so again, very similar numbers. Monterey County was one I noticed 239 releases, so almost doubling or more than doubling rather, numbers from a prior year. So I mentioned this, I think this is a helpful chart to look at for your own school districts because it can also help show how many young people might be in the county. Maybe they've moved since they were released. They might not. There might be, of course, various districts in a county, or there will be. But just to think through the need that's there, and who are the young people and students in the schools that you're working in. We don't have similar numbers for families, and I'll again try to distinguish here and there throughout my slides today. The difference between we focus so far on an unaccompanied child who's traveling on their own when they encounter immigration is on their own without a parent or guardian, rather, under 18. But families, of course, also travel together and seek protections at the border or apprehended by immigration. And we don't have numbers of how many of those families, should they be then released to defend their immigration court case here in the US, to which counties that they're living in. But you undoubtedly are, serving students that enter with a family, and the entire family is in an immigration court proceeding. So I included here, there we go, just a half of the sheet sample of an ORR verification of release form. I just included it here as a visual. You might have seen these, students might have brought them to you, or during enrollment might have seen these. This is one very fast way to identify that a student was in ORR custody and was determined to be an unaccompanied child. Even if they're now living with their parent, they would still be determined to be an unaccompanied child for federal immigration purposes. This document will also include their sponsor's name, that we of course redacted here, and their photo, the child photo rather. And this document can be used for identification purposes and for federal purposes. So this is the document that sometimes the only ID that a young person who was entered the country unaccompanied has with them to show their identity. Okay, so again, after the child has been released from OR custody, we talked a little bit today so far about the role of the sponsor. Again, the sponsor is, per this agreement with ORR, they do sign an agreement saying that they will be responsible for meeting the child's basic needs. It is not a legal guardianship under California law, but there are responsibilities tied to the sponsor's role, and one of those is enrolling the child in school. The child might receive post-release services through ORR, so they might be assigned a caseworker. This will depend on the needs of the child. They might have some time where they're receiving services from an ORR caseworker as well. In California, as we know, the child is most likely would be eligible for Medi-Cal. So there are some support services that are provided. The sponsor, though, is not provided with economic support to care for the child. And there can often be dynamics in the home, family dynamics with a young person new to a home, maybe who hasn't lived with their sponsor, even if that sponsor is their parent. Because again, a young person who is apprehended by immigration at the border and is now living with their parent, if they're released to them, they're still deemed unaccompanied if at the time they were apprehended, they were not with a parent or legal guardian. And while all of this is going on, the child is also often navigating complex trauma, including potentially trauma in home country, which might be tied to why they left their home country, including betrayal trauma, like abandonment, for example, of a parent, and also potential trauma that Melissa gave some examples of on their journey to the US. And they're also adjusting, as you know very well in your schools, adjusting to a new culture, different languages. In particular, I work with many young people who speak indigenous languages, primarily from Guatemala, where language support services in school are really hard to find. And so adjusting to learning maybe Spanish and English at the same time, and a new home environment, a new literal environment around them. And so a question I often get is, and I think someone might have asked a similar question already in the questions, but what is that young person's immigration status? So as Melissa said, they are undocumented. They do not have a legal immigration status. Federal law prohibits immigration from CBP at the border from deporting them back to their home country or back to Mexico for humanitarian reasons, but they're not given a legal status, even though they're allowed into the US. And I want to emphasize this because many young people I work with, I think, are often really unsure about what that means and are unsure about what the next steps are in their immigration case and how to describe their status, or what that even means, what an immigration status might mean. So when a young person, when an unaccompanied child or anyone really is arrested rather by CBP, often at the border, They are issued a notice to appear, and this is a charging document. So, you know, often we think about that in a criminal context. This is a document that charges someone with a violation of immigration law. In particular, in this context, often entering the country without permission or entry without inspection would be the terminology. Even if someone's coming to the border asking for asylum, which is their right to do, if they're an unaccompanied child and allowed into the country, they would still be issued this charging document. The notice, also called, again, notice to appear, also called the NTA. This document starts deportation proceedings against the child. So unaccompanied children they need to defend their deportation, even if they are an 8-year-old, 12-year-old, 17-year-old, been here a couple years, 20-year-old, they still have been charged with an immigration law violation that they would need to defend. This, again, the document includes charges against them. You might have seen this if a student brings you paperwork from immigration that includes the manner they entered the country, as well as where they are alleging the child's from, and they're alleging that they're not a U.S. citizen. But again, because they're unaccompanied children or deemed to be unaccompanied, they're allowed to enter the country as they defend their deportation. And once they're released to a sponsor, their immigration court date or their immigration court proceedings should be transferred to the immigration court in that region. Just taking a step back as well. So a family who enters would also be issued an NTA for everyone in the family. So they would also be issued charging documents. There are some manners in which families can request an appointment at the border through an app called CBP1, which they would need to do from Mexico. If they are allowed into the country through that process, they would be eligible for a work permit on a much faster basis than others. But they still don't have a lawful immigration status and would still need to find an attorney and to work on their case. But I mentioned that because you might see some families who have access to a work permit earlier, really just reiterating that every case can be very different, even if there's some similar things that align, and that children and families are navigating several systems at the same time. Okay, so just to take a minute and enter this image visually. This is just a standard image of an immigration court, but looks pretty spot on to the immigration court in which I appear most often in San Francisco. So maybe you have been to a court yourself, maybe even as a child yourself, or you've helped accompany someone to court. When you walk into the courtroom, it's often very still. People are nervous to talk. Often there's many families there. When you're there for what they call now the juvenile docket, so a certain day and time when the judge is only hearing cases for unaccompanied children or for children, mostly who are unaccompanied children. You see kids of all ages in the courtroom, just waiting in these benches that you can see here in the back of the photo, and everyone's kind of nervous and tense. So I just want to share that because this is part of the process that an unaccompanied child could be going through. If they have a court date, there could be anxiety that forms if they don't have a lawyer before this court date. And also, like, they might need to miss school or not be, or to meet with their lawyer, but also to attend court. There are various immigration courts across the state of California. They are primarily located in San Francisco. There's also now one in Concord. There's also one in Sacramento. There are a few locations in Los Angeles, and there's a court in San Diego. But it's a very big state. And so if you are located in another part of the state, you can imagine it can be several hours to drive to one of those cities. And a child who's in court would also need to find a way to get to court from anywhere they are. Whether they're in Northern California, Central Valley, Central Coast, would still have to get to the immigration court that has jurisdiction over their case. So what happens in an immigration court itself? Again, just to connect all of the dots, unaccompanied child who was issued an NTA. There are charges against them that they have to defend in immigration court to tie it all together. So individuals in immigration court have the right to seek an attorney in the sense that you can ask for more time to get an attorney for your case, but there's no right to an appointed attorney for most people, including children. There's some very limited exceptions for individuals who are detained, who are deemed to be not competent to reasonably engage in their case. But there has been extensive litigation over the years, but still no right to an appointed attorney, a government paid attorney for a child, even though they would be defending deportation to a place where they might be in danger or not have any family who would be able to care for them. So there is a right to have an interpreter in court, which is important to remind everyone of. And there's two different types of hearings. There's, kind of a status check-in. Do you have an attorney yet? Do you need more time? And then there's a longer, what's called an individual hearing, which is more like a trial with an adverse attorney from the Department of Homeland Security, from Immigration and Custom Enforcement, who is adverse to, in this instance, in this example, to the child. And the immigration judge can, and they do, deport children. And they also, though, can issue a deportation order if a child does not appear for court. It's an in absentia, so in their absence. So that's something just to flag and to be aware of if you're meeting with a family or a child and their caretaker and they missed a court date. We'll very soon talk about how to find out when their court date is. But just to keep that in mind that they might have been issued a deportation order. It's really important for them to do a consult with an attorney to see what options they have going forward. Okay, so this is a resource also in the lovely document that Californians Together is sending around. There are two ways to find out if somebody, anyone, in this case a child or a student, has immigration court. You can do it online through this portal. It's kind of hard to read in the slide, but there's the web address in the second column, or you can call a 1-800 number. And the information you need is the child's A number. This is a number that is assigned to anyone when they first have contact with immigration in various ways. But in this instance, when they are arrested at or near the border and issued the NTA. So on the NTA, but also that redacted document that I showed earlier on, the ORR release, you can find their A number. And with the A number, you can enter it into one of these, either the phone system or online, and you can choose English or Spanish. Unfortunately, that there are not other languages offered right now, but English or Spanish to see when a young person has court. But it's also a way to see if a deportation order was already issued, for example, if the family missed court. So I like to practice this with my clients if they still don't have a court date when they first meet with me. And so we like to practice calling it and then having them call it by themselves so they can do that on their own as well. I wanted to flag actually with this last slide that we are seeing many children who are released without a court date and whose court dates are not scheduled for many months, but also years, which can be confusing because you're told in OR custody, you have to go to court, you have to get a lawyer and go to court, but then you call this number and there's no court date scheduled. This is because the Department of Homeland Security, the attorneys who work for the government, need to file the charging document, the NTA, with the court. Sometimes I'll imitate that and do a little role play with my clients so they can understand that there's all these different pieces together and we're, need to deliver to the judge the charging, this document that says that they should be in court. And this is not happening in many cases. And so while a young person might not have a court date scheduled, they still do not have a legal immigration status, and it's still important for them when it's possible to connect with an immigration lawyer to be able to talk about paths forward for them and a way to potentially get their green card, which would be potentially a path if they wanted to becoming a US citizen. So if there's no court date, it'll say no case found for this A number. Okay. So I just started talking about this. How soon will a court date come? Some unaccompanied children will get a court date right away. So by the time they even are enrolled in school, if you called this number, there would be a court date already scheduled. And they have to go to court even if they don't have an attorney, which is really important because I mentioned if they don't go to court, they could receive an in absentia removal order, deportation order. So even if you're, sometimes it can really be helpful if there's capacity to help accompany a student to court, or if there's like volunteers who might be able to do that. I know that's a big ask, but it can be really scary to go to court by themselves. But to know that they can ask for more time because they're looking for an attorney. But some students or young people might live in the country for years without a court date, but they still don't have legal immigration status. And talking to some young people who have been here for 5 years and no court date, that can be, again, very confusing because your life is here, you're in school, you're building a future ahead, but you actually still are missing this one piece of stability around your immigration status. Just to note for families that you might be working with, many families are often scheduled with an immigration court date faster than unaccompanied children, and they might be placed on a judge's schedule called a dedicated docket, which is a really fast-moving process, and that gives them limited time to find an attorney before they're forced to go forward, which means applying for things like asylum on their own. Okay, so speaking of, we've said a couple of times, okay, how someone I think asked how unaccompanied children can gain citizenship. Here are a few our most common examples and some less common ones actually of how an unaccompanied child in particular, but also others who are immigration impacted, could potentially qualify for a form of humanitarian or other protection to get their green card. So many people on this call might have heard of asylum, and these are all defenses to the deportation proceedings. Whether or not there's court, these are all ways for a child to explain, this is why I'm here, I want to stay here, and here are different ways under the law that I can ask for help to stay here. I will note that I do work with young people who don't qualify for any of these protections, and those are really challenging conversations. So asylum is one form of relief, one protection that you might have heard of. And I'm not going to go into all of the details for each of these just for time purposes, but happy to connect with anyone about them as well. So asylum is a protection for someone who has been harmed or fears harm in their country based on a protected ground. So it's not just I'm scared to go back. It's because I was harmed or fear harm because of my race or ethnicity, my nationality, my religion, political opinion, or something has lots of different requirements, membership in a particular social group, which could be membership in their own family, or their sexual orientation, their gender and nationality, or other examples. This last one, membership in a particular social group, in particular like gender or nationality, and family membership was really heavily targeted under the first Trump administration. So there are ways that eligibility for asylum could be really limited or changed in various ways in the coming years. I wanted to note that some young newcomers in your school might be refugees. The definition of asylum is actually the definition of a refugee. A refugee is seeking protection outside of the US through a refugee resettlement process and is admitted with legal status. It comes to the US already with legal status. And there are additional steps to take in their cases. They would still be eligible to then apply for their green card, which is a more not actually permanent, but much more permanent protection. And somebody who is seeking asylum is undocumented in the US and is meeting the same definition as a refugee, if that's helpful to distinguish the two. Families could be seeking asylum altogether. A parent can seek asylum and include their children. So there are some, various ways that a young person in your school might be seeking asylum. Okay, so special immigrant juvenile status is another type of protection for children who are under 21 and unmarried, but more important, are not able to reunify with one or both of their parents due to some type of parental mistreatment. So if they've been abused by a parent, abandoned by a parent, this is quite a common form of relief in working with unaccompanied children who might now be living with a non-parent relative here as their sponsor, or even with one of their parents, but they experienced abuse or abandonment, neglect by their other parent or by one of their parents or both of their parents. U visas, Melissa mentioned earlier, this is a type of relief for somebody who is a victim of a crime here in the US. Just want to say, we don't want, all of these things are involving really hard topics and trauma as well, the young person's experienced. So we don't want this to happen to someone, but if it does, to flag it, it's really helpful to do a consult with an immigration attorney who is a victim of a crime here in the US and who cooperates with law enforcement. So needs to file a police report and cooperate with any ongoing asks by the law enforcement, police or DA, for example. And a T visa is a form of protection for a victim of a severe form of trafficking, which includes both sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking. And that I think is something really important to flag for young people who are maybe you notice someone is no longer in school, just being able to, again, not to give them legal advice, not to assess their case, but if they are working or they're coming into school really tired and learning more about working without pay or being forced to work these really long hours, just to do a consult with an immigration attorney, again, when possible. Okay, so I know I went through a lot of information quickly, but we're going to transition into talking through how ILD and Richmond High School in particular have been working together to support young people. So before we get there though, ILD has been working in both our current forum and our staff members in different organizations, working with Oakland Unified School District for quite some time, as well as other organizations that have worked there. The next few slides are we're borrowing them from our colleagues at OUSD who've given us consent to use them, but are sharing some more information about OUSD and our partnership with them. And so we want to start with this framing first and how we built the partnership, or how we're building still the partnership with Richmond High School. So in the 2013 timeframe, Oakland International High School, which is it works with and serves newcomer students, started seeing a really high uptick in the numbers of unaccompanied children. So again, in particular, children who had come to the US without a parent or guardian and were under the age of 18. They started seeing unaccompanied children from different parts, and mostly at that point from Central America. And they noticed that these young people, the students, had court dates and no lawyers to help them go to court. So the school, the community school manager at the time and others took note of that and also realized they had a hard time finding attorneys to refer the students to. Over time, and again, this started in 2013, so we're talking about over 10 years, they built partnerships with legal service providers and advocated for funds for the school district and other creative collaborations to be able to eventually create a system that helps identify students who have immigration needs, in particular unaccompanied children, but also families who have immigration needs, and have expanded that district-wide with the goal of connecting students and families to immigration legal services. They have found that there are clear benefits for students and families with the students to be able to learn, right? As you all know very well, need their basic needs met, including physiological, safety, and belongingness needs, and legal services when someone's anxiety over what will come next, where they can build their future, if remembering things in their past, even if something right is still manifesting for them in the way trauma is forming. Those are all things where potentially legal services can provide some support, but also being able to secure their immigration status and to help them with work authorization, their work permit. So with OUSD, OUSD helps identify students in their central office during enrollment with various questions, with not asking directly about immigration status, which they cannot do, but questions and offering services for families enrolling, about connecting them or learning more about immigration support. And the district keeps a wait list for students and families who then might need or asking for help finding immigration support. And OUSD staff are in constant contact with ILD, but also other organizations. You might have seen the numbers of Alameda earlier in the slide. There's a really big number of unaccompanied children and families who need legal services in the Oakland area. But as we can, we're taking students off the wait list based on a variety of factors that we've decided together around their age, around their vulnerability, or if they have court coming up, for example. So these are all things that might mean a student has a higher priority need for an immigration lawyer. And then we are working with the schools while we represent the student, should the student agree, where we use all the space at the schools. We sometimes help with documents back and forth. And we are also identifying others in the family who might need immigration support and trying our best to provide support to the entire family. So that led us to expanding our partnerships to other school sites, and in particular with Richmond High School. So I'll pass it over to Ivan to share more about his role in his school.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, everyone. My name is Ivan, pronouns he, him. And I'm a school counselor, secondary school counselor in West Contra, Costa Unified School District. I'm going to give you a little bit of my background, information about my background, so you can understand better why these type of partnerships are important to me and why I thought that it was something that we needed at the school. So I came to the United States. I immigrated from Mexico when I was 16 years old. I was a newcomer at Richmond High, the school that I work at. After I completed my higher education, I came back and I've been here for working as an educator for 11 years almost, at different capacities. And yeah, so we are a school, Richmond High is a school that is located in West Contra Costa. We have an enrollment of about 1,300 students. We're a school that has different academies. We have 4 career pathways academies. And we recently, like about 6-7 years ago, we started a partnership with the Internationals Network for public schools. And now we are happy to have our Internationals Academy here also at Richmond High School. We have a high number of English learners here at Richmond High. It's about 600 or more. And in internationals, we are so lucky to have the capacity to serve approximately 250 newcomers, where they get like different supports with language acquisition and also like referral to other resources and services here in the county or like in the school district. So for our partnership with ILD, these are some of the demographics. I want to include the demographics in the Internationals Academy so you can understand better the population that we serve. There's 93% of Hispanic students that we have in Internationals Academy. 4% have reported to be Asian or Pacific Islander, and then 3% reported older. I know that sometimes for educators it's difficult to ask the question about legal status for our newcomers, but I think that something that we need to remind ourselves is that you don't necessarily have to ask the direct question to offer a service. So one of the things that we did in Internationals Academy to understand better the need for immigration services for our kids is that we conducted an anonymous survey. So we gave a survey in our academy, and 147 students completed this survey. 11% of these students reported or identified as an unaccompanied youth based on the questions that we provided in the survey. These are questions that we also obtained through ILD to better identify what an unaccompanied youth is. And 21% reported to be undocumented. So I know that sometimes for a student it's difficult for them to trust in the system, to have a trusting adult that they can reach out when they have questions about their status, the immigration status. But I just think that it's important for us as educators to keep like sharing this type of information with them, and like not only once, but to repeatedly share the information, and just to let them know that there are resources here in the community and this type of partnerships where they can have access to an immigration attorney or an immigration lawyer that can explain their rights and can help them through these difficult processes.
Okay, thank you, Ivan.
Mhm.
So as we started to build a partnership with the Internationals Academy, a lot of the early steps were information gathering. You know, we have the amazing expertise of Ivan to help us through that and give us a sense of the school and his role, and some of the students. So we were able to meet with him, meet some of the staff in the Wellness Center, meet some of the teachers who teach the students in the Internationals Academy. That was really helpful. We provided trainings for staff members, just similar to what we just talked about today, about what the immigration flow looks like for unaccompanied children and families as well. We attended a back to school night. My table didn't get very many hits, but it was still really nice to be there. And that was kind of a learning experience of like, who comes, you know, who's going to stop by this table in this setting, right? So it was a learning experience for us, but it also got a really great sense of the community of the school. We created some tools together to help the team at the school figure out who might be unaccompanied. A child might not know that's the term that was, you know, decided for them, and provided some guidance on some internal ideas for how to identify or track students. We also, though, then that all led to us designing and holding so far 3 intake clinics to really get to know some of the needs of the students at the school. So we, in those intake clinics, we were able to provide kind of some more information to students, but also assess their eligibility for immigration relief. And then we've taken on many of those cases, and we'll do our best to take on as many as we can going forward. But knowing that we're a small team, we don't have a lot of capacity, but just being able to provide information to students and then taking on the cases as we can. And then also pursuing funding to be able to support our partnership. I mentioned the intake clinic. That was these clinics have been really great ways, again, to get to know the school. You're on site at the school. You get to learn the culture of the school as well a bit more, and meet the students, which is by far the best part of my job every day. So we brought team members to the school to conduct intakes or consultations with students. We worked with Yvonne to provide a private space at the school, which is really helpful, which is really great. It was hard, I think, right? It's just this, you all know better than me. Schools are busy. Everything's happening. There's so many needs happening at the same time. And so, being able to have a partner like Yvonne was really special to help us find that space and navigate things internally. Reiterating to students and to anyone at the school that what the students share is confidential. It's not something we can't just go and talk about their immigration case with someone at the school, even though we're coming on site for it. And then we are not mandated reporters as attorneys in California. We took on then a few cases from the start of the clinic, and then more and more. And then again, we've done 3, and we're planning another one hopefully for this winter. I know we already have some students lined up for it. So that's just been a way that we've been able to learn about the school, assess the needs of students, and start meeting with students with the support of the school. Anything you want to add there, Ivan, about our getting to know each other as a partnership?
Yeah, well, the only thing that I wanted to add is that sometimes I feel like one of the challenges that we encounter is that we don't feel, oftentimes people, educators, don't feel comfortable like having this conversation with students because they don't know when they're probably crossing a line, or like they don't want to by accident like give some type of advice. But I just want to like share that this is not what we're doing with this partnership. all we do, like, for example, in my case, my only role is to make sure that the students know that the resource is available to them, and just to make sure that we keep sharing this information with them so they know, like, when they're ready, they can come look for you and like they can access the resource. All we're doing is doing a referral to ILD, and they are the experts. They are the ones that meet with the students. They are the ones that provide the service.
Thank you. So a few learnings from our time working so far with Richmond International's Academy. So having a dedicated staff person, right? That might be one of you on the call today. That sometimes could be a community school manager or a school counselor. You know, the roles in my experience, even before doing partnership work with school districts, just getting to know as a nonprofit the schools in the area that where I served. You know, it's really varies so often on who in the school is able and wants to take that work on, because often it's extra work. It's almost always extra work. So we acknowledge that and really appreciate it. Learning more about the students in your school also has been really helpful for us, to get to be able to better serve what they need. And we know that you know, there could be shifting needs, right, in come next year, with the changing administration, of what the students in the school need and how we can provide that support. So being able to meet the district where it is really important, for what I've seen so far in our work together. And then the hardest part, I will say very honestly, is finding the attorneys near you, finding the legal service providers near you. But I also would encourage, I put a link in the chat with Immigration Advocates Network. Happy to also chat one-on-one with anybody about anything that I can share about any groups in their region. But you might know better than, hopefully will know better than me who might be there. Even if it's a partnership where you can only refer 5 cases because the nonprofit's really busy, I think there's still really ways that you can build more support for students that way. And starting small, I think that's just you know, as you're finding funding, as you're finding capacity, and building trust together, that starting small, I think is really effective, even though the need is so great, but trying to build a foundation. And pass it back to Ivan.
So I'm going to share a little bit of the outcomes that we have seen after after we started the partnership with ILD. So, I mean, first of all, I like to be really involved in, like, working with newcomers is something that has always been something that I love and enjoy. They're my community. I came from that community. So it is nice to always be like that trusting person that they can come and ask for support or resources. Like I said, everyone here who is working with newcomers, you already know that newcomers includes like subpopulation of students who come with gaps in their education. They speak different dialects. They may struggle with technology. So we need to make sure that we share this information and these resources in different ways, and we do it more than once to make sure that this information gets to them, right? After some of the ILD lawyers started working with some of our students, we noticed that more students are sharing with friends and with the teachers, that they have a better understanding about the complexities of the immigration system, but also they know more about their rights and their options. Teachers have shared with me that their students who were experiencing, had problems with attendance, behavior issues. When they attend the course and they know that all this information is something that may help their cases, they have seen an improvement in the attendance and other areas of the students' academic progress. Also, more students. There was a student that shared with me that she was really happy that she was able to get a work permit. I think that just hearing those things when they come, like they trust you, they come, they share those stuff with you, it's just like really rewarding, and just let us know that the partnership is working and it is good to have this type of resources for students available at the schools.
Thank you. And our end too, as the immigration lawyers, like so many times there's social services needs that are coming up around, helping with enrollment in Medi-Cal or helping with additional support services at school or elsewhere. And the school might not have a resource for it, but they often do. And so being able to ask my client is it okay if I talk to Yvonne or somebody else at the school about this, or help connect you? That's been a great way to kind of also provide and support more wraparound services for my clients and things that are outside of my expertise, but that often are the primary concerns for the students that I'm working with. And I'll just say to close that all of the different types of immigration cases that I mentioned, they all actually take a really long time. They take years and years and years right now. And we don't expect that to improve. So just keeping in mind that some of the emotional impact or uncertainty can go on for a very long time. So we also are really grateful for our school partners and being able to provide other types of services to help it in person, whether it's applying for financial aid or therapy services that are available on site or contracted out, or other school activities that help with the socio-emotional needs of the students as well as they're navigating these really complex immigration proceedings at the same time. I'll pass it back to Melissa.
Great, thanks. And I'll go very quickly because I know we have 8 minutes left and some outstanding questions. Katie, could you advance the slide for me? Thank you. This is just one thing I wanted to flag for folks that I mentioned earlier. It's called the California Caregiver Authorization Affidavit. It was a form that was created in the 80s in California, and it's a form that can be used by a caregiver who is not a parent or legal guardian. So, for example, a sponsor of an unaccompanied child who's an aunt or a grandparent, if they are over 18 and if they're caring for a child who's under 18 and they're not the parent or legal guardian, they can sign this form, and it gives that caregiver the legal right to do certain things on behalf of the child, such as enroll the child in school or consent for, school-related medical care. This is something we get a lot of questions on, and so we actually created an FAQ on how schools can use this for unaccompanied children, and I believe Sam put that in the document that he shared. So please contact us if you have any questions about using this for kids in your school. One other thing that I wanted to flag is that children, when they're released from ORR custody, should come out of ORR custody with what's called a case file. And that case file should include any health records that they accumulated while in ORR custody. They should have gotten immunizations when in ORR custody. So there should be immunization records. There should be any original documents like birth certificates. It should have education records. The education in ORR is not very good, but whatever documents they have should be in that case file. And it should have that verification of release form that Katie mentioned earlier. All kids are supposed to have this file. Sometimes it gets misplaced. Sometimes it's not clear what's in the case file or why it's important, but documents in that file can be very helpful at the time of enrollment. And so if you're working with a child to get them enrolled in school and the sponsor is saying that they don't have any of these documents or they don't know where they are, something that you can actually be very helpful with is help the sponsor or the child submit a request for those documents from ORR. There's something called the authorization for release of records. These slides will be shared, so I don't have to talk through every step, but it is a way for you to get that case file from ORR for the sponsor or child. Also, schools can request it. And so that can be very helpful in terms of enrollment. And I will pause there so that we can go to questions.
Thank you all again so much. There is just so much to know and to learn to be able to support everyone the way we want to. We have time for just a few questions for the group, and I want to uplift a couple that really came in. And Katie, you already addressed this a little bit, but I'm wondering, for school district practitioners in particular, there aren't necessarily hotlines around like maybe there once were, but maybe there are that we're not all aware of. And I'm wondering where people should go when they have an immediate question and what you would recommend in that regard.
an immediate question about immigration legal services?
Mhm.
Okay, so I included a link for the Immigration Advocacy Network, Advocates Network, which does include by county, different organizations that serve that county, or by state rather. And you can then, search, you can do a Google search with a search function in that page to find the county that you're in. That is one way to identify providers who are in your region. Yeah, but in terms of immediate questions, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, again, not that we would be asking you or wanting to give legal advice, but the Immigrant Legal Resource Center is also a really great statewide organization that has some basic practice guides and how-tos on things. I think Immigrants Rising is also a really great organization in terms of providing some information around financial aid and other not necessarily immigration legal services, but some questions around financial aid or career training for undocumented students.
Thank you. That's helpful. Quick one, I think, especially for Yvonne, thinking about school district staff, teachers, principals, admins, community school managers who believe they do serve unaccompanied children. Can you walk them through a little bit how you might identify them in a way that is safe?
Yes. So like I explained before, I know that one of the worries is that it is sometimes it's difficult to ask the question because I know that there's fear of some students disclosing their status, the immigration status here in the country. But I think that there's ways to have these conversations without directly asking the question to students. It's just like sharing the information in class, like through a presentation or like coming and like just sharing about the different resources that are available within the district and the county to support these students, and just being that person. In my case, like I'm a school counselor, so I act like the bridge of information between the resource and the student, and I make sure that if the student comes and shares that they need access to this specific resource, I connect them with them. But yeah, I mean, I guess it is kind of our responsibility as educators also to make sure that we are constantly learning about these different awesome resources and like bring them to our students' attention.
I
I don't know
think
if
that's great. Well, and I think so key there is that it's a trusted person at the school. And that anonymity you provided is really valuable. A question I have for the group, both for Katie and Yvonne, in emulating your partnership and Melissa looking from the outside, if there are folks at a school or district who are looking to partner with a legal service provider, how do you recommend they go about thinking about that funding, that selecting a provider? How might this sort of thing be scaled?
Sure. I mean, I think the selecting a provider that, again, that the resource that I sent is one way to identify providers that are in your area. I think that to the extent you're in conversation with other types of social services providers or other advocates in the area as well, being able to, hear about and learn about organizations that might be providing services there. I also think that, as you talk to students, if they're having a positive experience with their lawyer, if you already know a student is receiving immigration services, and it's ideally a free service, although definitely not going to be the case across the board. Sometimes the partnerships might be with a private attorney who might be able to have a lower cost, for example, for representation, just based on capacity in some parts of the state or many parts of the state. But I think that reputation piece is really hard. And I think that it's hard for, nonprofits can also change in their makeup over time too, which is really hard to say that, it's hard to give even recommendations always from the nonprofit standard and point of view. But I think that community reputation does carry really far. And so just talking to people in the community who might do different work even, but might have contact with immigration legal services providers. The funding piece, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that I think I can speak from Ali's perspective. So we have received, private funding. That part of that we're able to leverage for both the direct services, but also our partnership building. I think that right now we've been focused on private foundation funding, but being able to talk about our work with the school district as well, and why that work is really important, and also trying to find funding for our school district partners, who are doing this extra work as well, and having some of their time compensated as well.
Thank you, Katie. I see we're at 5:01 now, and incredibly, there are 88 people here at 5:01 p.m. on a Thursday this week. It's so great to be here together. Thinking through our months ahead, this is, well, I was going to say it's a marathon without a finish line, but there is a finish line. And so just appreciating each other and all the work that we can do together, that there are these wonderful lawyers out here to advise and support us. There are wonderful school staff like Yvonne helping everyone. It's very inspiring. Thinking through just a little advert for the next CalNEW webinar. It'll be very related. We're going to have the California Newcomer Network, Californians Together, and Reimagining Migration talk about ways to create a safe and inclusive environment for newcomer youth in the schools. It's really thinking about what does that look like in the classroom to support that emotional safety? What does it look like at the school site to create that sort of environment that Yvonne helps create, where students are really able to actually seek information? And then really at the district level, what are those board policies we can put in place to provide that sanctuary and protection? So we hope you'll join us then. Thank you again to our presenters. We will be sending out slides, recording, and all those resources by early next week. And everyone be well.